going on, guys? Welcome to another episode of Bro History. It's Henry Zamota and Danny Abdel-Jabbar. What's up, man? How are you?
Doing good, man. How about you?
I'm doing well. Do you know what I did this weekend?
What'd you do?
I went to the Harry Potter and the Cursed Child Broadway play.
Well, that's awesome. How was it?
It was, I liked it. If you're a Harry Potter fan, I'm a big Harry Potter fan. For people, I don't know if I've ever told anyone on this show. Harry Potter. A big fan of the books. The Goblet of Fire is probably my favorite fantasy book of all time.
Even over the Game of Thrones series?
I don't think over the Game of Thrones series, the Goblet of Fire is my favorite fantasy book. Mm-hmm. Have we ever talked about Harry Potter before?
I don't know. We've had like 132 episodes, so
are you a Potterhead?
High. I like Harry Potter.
Do you Hogsmeade?
Yeah, I like Harry Potter. I never read the books when I was younger, and I never read them when I was older. But the last book I listened to on like audio tape or whatever, back when you had to like illegally download them on like fucking LimeWire or whatever. Anyway, I listened to the last one, and it was cool. I always liked the movies because they were like fun, and then I liked that, you know, Daniel Radcliffe and like, you know, all those folks were about our age, and like they grew up at the same time that we did, and like, you know, it was fun to like see them kind of grow up on screen and like, you know, identify with them in that way. I don't know, it got trendier and trendier every time, and they were very, very enjoyable series.
The movies were good, but I think a lot of people like myself who are hardcore into the books, I mean, whenever somebody is hardcore into a book, they're always disappointed by the film adaptation, mainly because when you're reading a book, or especially a fantasy book, you're imagining it in your head the way certain things take place.
Right,
so
and if it doesn't line up with the movie, then you're like, oh, fuck this.
Yeah, but with the movie, they did such a great job casting where
I think so.
Now when I read the books or when I reference the books, I think of those actors, at least the main trio of actors, you know, between Harry and Hermione. But this play was about 8 hours long. They had to break this thing. They had to break this thing up into two parts. So there was 2 3-hour shows with about a 2-hour break in between. It was long as hell, and
that's a commitment.
It really is a commitment, and but it was good. I liked it. I've got the Cursed Child like the script. It was published prior. I think around the same time the play was released. But
did you read it?
I read it. I read like the first 50 pages, and I just didn't find it very readable. Like it wasn't fun to read like a Broadway script. So I put it down and never reached the conclusion of it. So it was nice. It was a lot better.
Was it a musical?
It was not a musical.
Oh, thank God.
There was a lot of robe dancing.
Robe dancing?
A lot of robe dancing.
Okay.
A little weird sometimes, but I mean, it was crazy the things that they were able to pull off on a stage. I didn't think it was basically watching a magic show and a play at the same time.
Cool.
But enough of that. I know that is kind of dorky and boring. Let's move into the main topic of today, which is actually pretty complicated. And I'm going to admit first that a lot of the stuff that we're going to be talking about today is still happening in real time. We're going to be talking about Syria and Turkey, and I guess what seems to be their impending stampede into war with each other. Or, I mean, you can even say they're at war with each other technically right now because they're firing upon each other and killing each other's soldiers actively. But there's so much. There's a lot of exaggeration going on, and there's a lot of moving parts and a lot of players that span outside of Syria into other countries in the greater Middle East where it's going to get confusing. So Danny and I think, are going to be talking through it because we did our own research on this, and we're probably going to be learning things from each other today just because there's a lot of things that are pretty hazy with this topic.
There's just like a lot of lies going around too. I want to make that very clear. Like some of the shit that we're going to talk about, like we have to rely on the on the ground sources, on these state run media outlets to like tell us what the fuck is going on. So there's going to be some stuff that's totally conflicting. And we'll try and point those things out wherever we see them. But like, you have to take this with a grain of salt because, you know, it's happening right now and the news sources aren't great.
The news stories aren't great because they're coming out of Turkey and Syria, I mean, and Russia. Not exactly.
They're not exactly known for their free press.
Not exactly known for their free press. So we're depending on despotic governments basically to get us our news. Now, before we get into it, I think we should lay a little bit of groundwork because, it's funny. We actually talked about Syria was probably one of the main things that we talked about when we first started this podcast. And now it seems like we really don't talk too much about Syria unless there is some type of major movement that takes place in Idlib, which is going to be the setting of this podcast. Just to give you some backstory. So everyone's probably aware that there is a war in Syria. There has been a war in Syria for almost a decade at this point. For many years, it's been very bloody. It's probably the biggest and largest scale modern war in the 21st century. And just to do a very quick, like Game of Thrones style recap, before you move into, a new season, you get like that whole
10-minute rundown.
10-minute rundown. I'm not even going to give a 10-minute rundown. It's going to be more of like a 30-second rundown. So in the war in Syria, the Syrian army, so Assad's forces, the government there, when they were fighting a lot of these rebels, their major goal was to free up a lot of the major population centers near Damascus. And in doing so, when they started to free those areas, they pushed all of the rebels, which included a lot of jihadist Salafist type rebels with allegiance to Al-Qaeda. They pushed all these different groups into one province in northwestern Syria. And this province is called Idlib. So what you had was a bunch of different jihadi factions all in this one governance, which really isn't that big. And they started fighting each other. The group that emerged out of this was a group called, well, at least the major player right now is an Al-Qaeda linked group called HTS. They are essentially they're Al-Qaeda. If you want some proof of how radical these guys are, go to type in Bilal Abdul Karim into your YouTube. Go to OGN, On the Ground News. It's a news outlet that covers the Syrian war from the perspective of the jihadist rebels over in Idlib. And I actually watch it because, any news source I feel is good. You want to get multiple news sources. But this guy interviews these guys, and, they're completely nuts. Have I ever shown you any of these videos from OGN?
Yeah, you sent me a few links. They're fucking crazy.
It's funny because their news outlet, it's a news outlet, and honestly, it's a well-done news outlet. This guy, Bilal Abdul Karim, he's actually an American from New York. We've spoken about him a number of times. He's a stand-up comedian turned journalist, and the guy's pretty interesting. He's from Harlem. He went up to Syria around 2013 or 14, and maybe even earlier than that. He went to Syria, and he started covering the not the moderate rebels. He started covering a lot of the Al-Qaeda linked ones. And this guy is apparently the U.S. government is trying to kill him, or at the very least, that's what he says. There's been at least, according to him, there's been 5 drone strikes on this guy that have failed. But he sued, I believe he sued the State Department for not releasing the documentation that he was on a kill list. I forget the exact story, but allegedly the U.S. is trying to kill this guy. But he produces news and he interviews these nut jobs, and the first words that come out of their mouth are always a good minute rant about praising Allah and how
of course
the conquest of the brutal Assad will die and there will be a jihad. Like it's as crazy as you could imagine. So I would encourage you guys to look at OGN. It's their own network. It's not like somebody who's trying to spin it to make them look crazy. It's their own stuff that they're actually putting out, or at least somebody who sympathizes with them is putting out. Just watch it. And you'll notice that a lot of these guys that he's interviewing are white boys from Eastern Europe and not even Arab. So it shows you that it's not just an Arab thing when it comes to a lot of these Salafists. So let's all right. So that rant was a little out of nowhere, but in Idlib right now, where this war is taking place, where the last of the war is taking place, because the war is kind of wrapping up right now, and it has been wrapping up for a while now. It's kind of like a really slow conclusion. It's a slow, kind of painful conclusion, like somebody with a diagnosis of like stage 4 cancer who's battling it through chemo. This thing is not ending, but there has been progress. So there is a highway system in northern Syria that everyone's fighting for. It's called the M4 highway and the M5 highway. The M4 highway goes from the east of Syria, the northeast of Syria, through Aleppo, and then to the Mediterranean Sea. At some point, the M4, when it passes through Aleppo, you can merge, or it turns into, I don't know the exact route, but it goes into the M5 highway. The M5 highway goes from Aleppo all the way down to Damascus and to southern Syria. So for anyone who's on the East Coast, it's kind of like I-95, the I-95 of Syria. Like it connects
the major cities, right?
It connects New York City, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., all the way down to Florida. It connects the government with the industrial centers, which is Aleppo. Aleppo is the industrial center of Syria. So it was a very important highway. And the main campaign taking place right now in Syria is for the SAA, the Syrian Arab Army, to free, I think it's probably about 50 or 60 miles of a highway that they'll probably have to free in each direction to begin construction on it, because right now the civilians who live over in Aleppo, they're kind of isolated because the roads were all destroyed in the war.
Right.
So they're trying to capture enough roads so they can connect these major cities with each other. So it's a very serious campaign. Now, in 2018, there was, right when the blunt, because, the Syrian army is a blunt force. It's not some, if it wasn't for Russia, they wouldn't have as much success with their, air. I mean, dude, they literally were dropping barrels with bombs in them in the beginning of the war.
Yeah.
Like you could see these just bizarre videos of a Syrian helicopter. They're flying over like some center where there's a sniper in it, and they're dropping a barrel with explosives in it, like IEDs in it. It's the most ridiculous. It's
not exactly
shit.
Precision.
No, it's not. It's not precision.
Yeah.
And it's like, you get mad. Barrel bombs is one of those things that you do hit Assad with, but to me, it's like the gas, whether they're real or not, whether the gas attacks are real or not. I don't want to get into that in this episode. However, it's like, to me, it's like, what's the difference? Like, you have a barrel bomb. Like, what's the difference in discrimination between a barrel bomb and gas? Like, it's a fucking barrel bomb. The bomb, it takes like a good 60-second countdown between when the bomb is released from the helicopter and when it lands on its destination, and anything can affect that barrel when it's on its way down. The
wind conditions, like random shit on the ground, like you name it. Yeah,
there's no precision whatsoever. It ain't a cruise missile. So I just kind of think it's hilarious that we draw these arbitrary lines of what's a weapon of indiscriminate capability and what's not.
So barrel bombs are cool. Like out of curiosity, this is funny that I don't know this, but like, are barrel bombs okay via like Geneva Convention shit? Because the gas is not.
I don't know if the barrel bombs are addressed on the Geneva Convention, to be completely honest.
They update a lot of that shit frequently, but like cluster bombs, you can't use cluster bombs, But like barrel bombs are cool.
I would imagine that they're not, but I actually could be wrong about that. But I mean, regardless,
in my opinion, they're not, because yeah,
it's a barrel with a bomb. Like it's the best name for a weapon ever. It's the most honest name for it.
It's almost as crazy as bat bombs.
It's almost as crazy. It's not bat bombs. Well,
bat bombs are fucking crazy.
So yeah, back to the M4 and the M5. So they're trying to liberate these highway systems to I mean their economy depends on it. You know, if for the Syrian government right now is in a lot of economic trouble. Obviously, after a brutal war for many years that ravaged most of the countryside. Now it's isolated to one section, but still these key highway zones are, you know, it would be like if parts of Massachusetts that weren't liberated yet in America, or parts of New England weren't liberated yet. So they're trying to free the zone up. Now, on the other side, in Turkey, you know, the Turks, the Russians, and the Syrians, they all signed an agreement back in September 2018 to create a buffer zone between Turkey and Syria, because Idlib is up north near the border of Turkey. And in that, you know, there was a number of conditions that were placed in this buffer zone, and this buffer zone went through the main governance of Idlib city in the Idlib province. So why don't you go over? You have the list of what the conditions are for this buffer zone that was created back in September of 2018, right?
So I actually didn't focus on the buffer zone from September 2018. I focused on the first buffer zone that was in August 2019, and then the second northern Syria buffer zone in October. But so I think you wrote down a couple of things on here. But basically, the big points of it was removing radicals and removing weapons from the zone, that northern province area. So, for example, all tanks, artillery, MLRS, mortars, things like that from the conflicting parties had to be withdrawn from that demilitarized zone by October 10th, 2018. And then the armed forces of the Republic of Turkey and the military police of the armed forces of the Russian Federation would carry out coordinated patrols and monitoring using unmanned aerial vehicles in the militarized zone. Another point that you didn't have on here, but that I remembered from my readings, was that while Turkey was able to use unmanned aerial vehicles and reconnaissance planes, they were specifically told not to use warplanes, so fighter jets, attacker jets, things like that. And that airspace is currently being controlled with a no-fly zone by the Russian Air Force. That was the only other thing that you didn't have on there. And also a point of that would be, ensuring free movement of local residents, as well as restoring trade and economic ties. So basically transit stuff along both the M4 and the M5 highways. And then that was supposed to have been restored by 2018. And you noted that, the roads were never reopened for civilian traffic. They are still very fucked, those roads. And plenty of ceasefires happened between October of 2018 and today. And those ceasefires continuously break down. So I guess the point you were trying to make about this original buffer zone that they tried to make way back in October 2018 was that none of this shit happened, and none of the terms of these conditions were fulfilled by Turkey.
Yeah, and to add one more thing is that, so the agreement, Danny's referencing to the Google Doc we shared with our notes of this podcast when he says yours. But one of the things also is that all radical groups would be withdrawn from the demilitarized zone by October 15th. I don't know if you said that or not.
I mentioned that, but it's an important point, though.
But let me just pontificate on that a little bit more. So Idlib is still under the control of Al-Qaeda-aligned Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. So Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is basically a rebranding of al-Nusra. Al-Nusra is basically a rebranding of Al-Qaeda of Iraq that split up between ISIS and Al-Qaeda after the Iraq insurgency.
Yeah, the band has gone through a lot of phases since then.
So it's like HTS is an internationally recognized terrorist organization by the United States and Turkey. So Turkey has done nothing to remove this, and it is very likely that they're arming and abetting HTS. So
by proxy, of course.
By proxy, they're it's very likely that they're they're aligned with them. So that's another term that has not been another term that has not been met by the Turks, which has led to this, which has led to full out casualties now from Turkey and from the Syrian Arab army, from Turkish artillery.
And I guess an important point to point out is that, they were supposed to be removing all tanks and artillery and things like that from those demilitarized zones by the end of that. But actually what we've been seeing over the last couple of weeks here is just quite the opposite. We've got here that over 1,450 Turkish military vehicles, including tanks, heavy artillery, armored infantry vehicles, have been pouring into the Idlib area, just right across the border. I actually watched this dope video. I got to send it to you, Henry. They don't say anything interesting, but just watching the convoys of all of these vehicles going, it's like a 14-minute video. And they're packing some serious hardware, like really big medium tanks, all the cranes and operational shit, like scores and scores of these armored personnel carriers. And what I found really interesting was they're also trucking in these bulletproof guard posts, right? So it's like these big concrete blocks that have a door on it and some windows and stuff that are supposed to be pretty, bulletproof. I'm sure you can smash the shit out of it with some heavy mortar fire, but they're trucking in tons and tons of these things too, so that they can continuously create more military quote observation posts deeper and deeper within Syria. And basically what they do is they take these posts and they create basically nobody wants to go to war. I don't actually think Syria and Turkey want to go to war with each other, but there's a lot of shit going on that kind of makes them do shit and kill each other nevertheless. And so I think the play that Turkey's doing here is if they set up more and more of these observation posts, it ups the ante for for Syria, right? On the one hand, Syria's got this job to do. They want to free up the M4 and the M5 highways. They want to do some infrastructure rebuilding there, so they can bring some stability to their country after almost a decade of war. And then on top of that, they want to remove a lot of these radicals that are just been hiding out in Idlib for this whole time and just kind of put the nail in the coffin. But if there is an observation post with a bunch of Turkish military there, they have to go around or they have to engage Turkey, and they don't exactly want to do that. And so what we see is Syria is doing a lot of pincer moves where they're trying to circumvent and go around the observation posts. But as fast as they're making advances around these observation posts, Turkey is creating new ones, right? And this makes it really, really nuts. It's like a game of chess. It's like moving all your pieces in the area, and Turkey's definitely putting a lot of pawns out to block the advance, but they've got it backed up with heavy artillery, heavy machinery.
And that's an excellent point. What they're doing right now is that they're essentially putting meat shields everywhere in Idlib. Turkey is putting meat shields there. So with these outposts, and then they're saying that the 1,450 Turkish military vehicles, which include tanks, which include heavy artillery, which include armored infantry vehicles, their pretext is saying that they're just going to back up the these observation posts, but in reality, it seems like they're setting them up and gearing them up for an active strike against the Syrian Arab army. Now, with all these Turkish soldiers that are embedded in these areas, it puts them at a lot of risk because the Russians and the Syrians are actively bombing the shit out of Idlib right now, and they're actively on a full-scale military campaign to take a big chunk of Syria. If you look at maps between February 3rd and about February 10th of the area that Syria has taken control of, or the government has taken control of, it's a really big chunk. It's a lot of moves. I don't remember this much significant territory gain since the overall campaign in Idlib has taken place. But it looks like, if you look at a map between February 3rd and if you look at a map between February 3rd and February 10th, it looks like they took out about 5 to 10% of the land in the Idlib governance. So it's a pretty significant chunk. And it goes over one of the major cities they took was at one point like a major losing spot in 2013. It was a battle that the Syrian army lost in the beginning of the war. So I'm sure there was a lot of personal victories in that as well. But that was actually being used as an observation post prior to them freeing that city up. Or that town up. I mean, these are just like small little towns that are next to each other. So, it's with the Turks kind of embedded there. They're just active meat shields, and I don't think it's their intention to have their soldiers die. But yeah, as you said, I think it's as a way to make the Syrian Arab army and the Russians think twice about moving forward with the rest of their campaigns.
Yep, and I think what's important to note, despite these moves that Turkey's making, is that they're totally fucked. Like they're completely and utterly fucked. So Russia and Syria control the airspace over Idlib, and Russian warships are on the coast of Syria, ready to launch cruise missiles at any point, right? So they've got a target on their back doing this shit. So they're playing a very dangerous game. I think after the 2016 coup against Erdogan,
this is a quote that I grabbed from Moon of Alabama, the foreign policy blog right here. So.
Right. So after the 2016 coup attempt against Erdogan, nearly 3/4 of Turkey's Air Force pilots were dismissed. So they don't have pilots. And the maintenance status of Turkey's 240 F-16 fighter jets is not great. It's dubious. It is estimated that less than a quarter of them are ready to fly. The F-16s are no match for the Russian Su-34s and Su-57s, I might add, which cover Syria. They also lack the capabilities to overcome Russian air defenses, which are on the ground there. And then there is also Russian economic leverage over Turkey. So we kind of talked about that last point, the economic leverage in the last episode. So, tourism in Turkey from Russia is really high. They also have certain military industrial complex contracts between each other with the S-400 systems, as well as just trade and a bunch of other economic things. So Turkey has a vested interest, both militarily and economically, not to fuck with Russia, and Russia's all over this area. I think you wrote a couple things here. So for tourism, 7 million Russians visited Turkey, which it was the top destination of Russians where they go on holiday. Nuclear cooperation. So the Akkuyu nuclear reactor was built by Russians, and that's in Turkey. The Turkish Stream pipeline is Russian. The Turkish exports to Russia are almost 3 billion. And the Turkey imports about 40% of its gas from Russia. So there's a ton of things that are going on there, and they're playing a really dangerous game.
Yeah, and it makes me think that a lot of what Turkey, I don't think Turkey's stupid. I don't think Erdogan's dumb. Now, there's another whole part of this that I want to get into as well regarding, I guess there's two other parts of it. Turkey's activity in Libya, as well as Turkey's, their stance with the PKK right now, which is the Kurdish party that they're not really too fond of. But before we get into that, I want to talk about, is this all fucking propaganda or what? Now, here's where I'm really confused about. I'm really confused about this, and I probably won't know this until a couple days from now when these sources are laid out by a really good journalist. Yeah. But what happened is that Turkey is claiming there's kind of like a tick for tack going on right now. So there's been bloodshed. So Syria killed 6. This happened back on February 3rd, I believe. Syria killed 6 Turks, and they responded with what they said what was an airstrike,
which is total bullshit, by the way.
Which was total horseshit.
Right. There's no way the Russians were going to let them fly warplanes in.
There's no way that they'd be able to fly in that airspace without being shot down.
Yeah, and that would be big news too, in and of itself.
That would be big news because they're in NATO, and then of course Mike fat boy Mike Pompeo is like, they're a NATO ally. Well, we need to come to the defense of our NATO ally. God. We need to come to the defense to our despotic NATO ally, Turkey, Erdogan. So I think it's horseshit. They said that they killed about 100. They were like, we killed 104 Syrians, Syrian Arab armies. And in reality, first of all, they lied about what their strike was, and
they also didn't specify that they killed soldiers. They just said Syrians, so it's also likely that they killed like civilians.
We killed. Yeah, that's their response. We killed a bunch of brown people, other brown people.
You see, the thing you got to know about this is, and this is where we get really confused, and that's why we're not laying out like too specific, numbers and things like that for this, is because where we're getting this information is coming from both Turkish media outlets and Syrian media outlets, and to a certain extent Russian ones as well. And all three of those countries have a vested interest in controlling the narrative in their favor. And all three of those countries don't have
free press.
Well, yeah, I mean, they have, quote, free press, but like, let's be real, they're state owned or state influenced at the very least. And so when we read about this shit, it's like, oh, Erdogan killed 100 Syrians. It's like, really? Because I didn't hear that from the Syrians. And then, Russia, Turkey did a airstrike. And it's like, really? Because the Russians said you didn't, So I'm really not sure. I don't know what the fuck is going on here. It's nuts.
Apparently, so there was another. So Syria claimed that they killed about 50 or so. These numbers are just they're just so completely random. That there was another artillery strike, because I guess they caught on, like no one would believe it was an airstrike, and they killed between 50 and 100 Syrians. I don't know I forget the exact number I forget the exact propaganda number that they laid out.
There have been too many of them to remember. Like, they literally keep changing the numbers. Yeah. Like, every article that I read is a different fucking number. So I can't even tell you. First it was
70, then it was 100,
and then it was
50,
35. I heard 35 in one article. Like, it doesn't make any sense. I literally cannot tell you what the number is. It's a number between 1 and 100. There you go.
It's saving face.
Yeah.
And I don't know. And then there's no footage of it either.
Yeah, there isn't.
Like,
yeah.
Usually these things, there's a lot of footage of airstrikes.
I mean, everybody has a smartphone, even in Syria. You think somebody would have caught this, but you got nothing.
You know how much crazy shit's documented in Syria? Like, a lot of airstrikes are documented in Syria.
Right. How do you think we got those images of the barrel bombs and the gas attacks and all this other shit?
There's no footage of gas attacks.
Well,
there's footage of people acting like they. I said I didn't want to get into this.
Yeah, we don't have to. It's fine.
All right. So, yeah, we don't fucking know. Who knows, like, what the reality of the situation is. But, like, I don't think that Turkey. I mean, Turkey has such a vested interest with Russia that this is just a way for them to seem strong in this battle. And also, they want to preserve that buffer zone because, I mean, they just want to have. Ideally, what they want is they want to be able to negotiate the end of that war within a position of power. And the more area that's liberated by Syria and Syria and Russia, the less of a position of power and the less influence they'll have in Idlib to be part of that negotiating table.
Yeah, no, totally. I agree with that. And the one question that really has been, like, burning in the back of my mind that I kind of touched on in the last episode, but I really just dove into it, in our research here is, I want to make this known that I don't support the Syrian government. I definitely don't support Russian government. I also at this juncture don't really support the Turkish government, so I don't like any of these people. But I keep trying to be objective and like ask the question, like who is acting lawfully and who isn't. And Erdogan keeps saying that their infiltration and subsequent occupation of these observation posts in Syria is legal. And the specific reason that he points out in a lot of these things that I've been reading is the Adana Agreement. And I want to talk a little bit about the Adana Agreement, but I also want to talk about the different buffer zones in addition to the one that we just described from 2018, the newer buffer zones, to kind of like pick apart the legality of this here, because my initial hypothesis that I had, my bias coming into this was, this is all Syria. This is Syrian land, right? I might not agree with Syria. I might not like the Syrian government, but at the end of the day, Turkey is in another country, right? And they're acting with impunity there. And, if they weren't there, we wouldn't see this conflict and there wouldn't be bloodshed, right? And so I keep asking myself the question, like, does he have legal recourse in doing this? Is he acting legally? Is there a reason for this? So I looked into the Adana Agreement, and I think it's impossible for us to talk about the Adana Agreement without going into, the Kurdish question here. And if you want really detailed information about this, you should check out our episode that we did on the Kurds. It was a very popular episode. And if I pull up the thing here, I can probably tell you what episode it was, but never mind. We did like about 3 episodes on Syria and the Kurds. Right. So the Kurdish question was like back in October 10th. So it's still pretty fresh, but it's maybe like 20 episodes back. So check it out if you want more information on that. But here's the TLDR for that. So we talk about this thing. You have to know about the PKK. That's the Kurdistan Workers' Party, right? It's a Kurdish far-left militant and political organization based in Turkey and Iraq, right? It was started by this guy named Abdullah Öcalan in 1972, who created the Communist Kurdish Party, the PKK. Now, the PKK has been in armed conflict with Turkey, with a couple of ceasefires in between, with the aim of basically achieving a independent Kurdish state. But then they later changed their stance to demanding equal rights for the Kurds and setting up some Kurdish autonomy in Turkey. And they've been doing this since 1984. The PKK specifically, I made this point in the Kurdish question episode, and I want to make this clear here too. PKK is a political and military party. It is made up of Kurdish people, but this is not Kurdish people, right? So big umbrella is Kurdish, small umbrella is PKK. Okay, cool. So the PKK...
let me just add to what you're saying. Just because you're Kurdish doesn't mean that you belong to the PKK.
Exactly. Thank you.
It's not all Kurdish people within Turkey
or anywhere for that matter are PKK.
or anywhere belong to these political / militant parties. There are a lot of Kurds in Turkey who are part of the system, who are part of the government, who are part of the upper class, not every single Kurd in Turkey is a militant PKK, communist.
Exactly. So I just want to make that super clear. So, but to be clear, the PKK has been listed as a terrorist organization by several states and organizations, including NATO, the U.S., United Kingdom, Japan, the European Union. However, a bunch of United Nations member countries like Switzerland, China, India, Russia, Egypt, and so on have not designated the PKK as a terrorist organization. So there's a bit of a split on whether or not they're a terrorist organization. It just depends on which country you ask.
That's how you know. That's how you know it's purely political. How these different groups are labeled terrorist organizations.
Right. right?
It's all politics, internal politics of the country.
And to be clear, there are good reasons to name PKK as a terrorist organization. They've done terrorism, right? They've like killed people. They've done like suicide bombings, things like that, for sure. But it's complicated. I don't want to get too deeply into it.
They're like Hezbollah.
Yeah, if you want to know more about it, listen to the actual episode. But generally speaking, the PKK's ideology was a fusion of like revolutionary socialism and Kurdish nationalism. And what they wanted to do was create a communist state in the region, and they wanted to call it Kurdistan. And when I say the region, I don't mean specifically just Turkey, but also northern Syria and northwestern Iraq, right? And this is where the Kurdish diaspora lives. They're spread out across a bunch of different disparate countries. Now, the initial reasons why the PKK wanted this was literally because the Kurds have been oppressed in Turkey, right? So a couple of points on that. Kurdish language, dress, folklore, and even names were banned in Kurdish inhabited areas in Turkey. The words Kurds, Kurdistan, Kurdish, those were officially banned by the Turkish government temporarily, but still. The Kurdish language was officially prohibited in public and private life in Turkey. Many who spoke or published or sang in Kurdish were arrested and imprisoned, which is nuts. So they got good reason, right, to want their own thing, because Turkey didn't treat them very nicely, but they also that's not like a good reason to do terrorism. Let's just be very clear. So since PKK started, they've been involved in clashes with Turkish security forces. More than 40,000 people have died as a result of this on both sides, but the majority of them were Turkish, Kurdish civilians. Today, there are 30 to 40 million Kurds who live in parts of Turkey, Syria, Iran, Iraq, but the borders are really in dispute. But one thing that's important to note, and I'll try and get off this Kurdish point and get to the Adana Agreement in a second here, but this is important. So Kurdish people make up 20% of the population of Turkey. So percentage-wise, that's more than the 12.7% Black or African Americans in the U.S. as of the 2010 census, right? So, as a matter of percentages, there are more Kurds than there are in Turkey than there are African Americans in the U.S., right? So it's a huge, huge group, and it's a huge voting bloc. So there's like this political question that comes up. Now, in terms of like their ideologies, they're a Sunni Muslim majority, but they've existed. Kurdish people, that is, have existed prior to Islam, and they don't like Turkish people. They don't identify as Arabs. They're different. But at the moment, there's a split amongst the Kurds in terms of like what they want, but almost no one is calling for a sovereign Kurdistan. Rather, most of them want autonomy and equality in their host nations, much like how we have the Peshmerga set up in northwestern Iraq, and they have their own little thing there, and how the Kurdish people are fighting for autonomy in northeast Syria. Not so much in Iran. I don't think they're giving them that many allowances there. But without taking sides on this, what makes this situation super complicated is that they've been fighting ISIS since the start of ISIS, and they've arguably been among the most effective fighting force against them. So this makes it super complicated in terms of like, should Turkey be fighting against them? But let's talk about the Adana Agreement for a second and the link between Turkey and Syria.
Well, Turkey should be fighting with them because they arm these Salafist groups. The enemy is my friend, right?
Yeah, I suppose so. I don't know. Anyway, let's talk about the
Turkey and Saudi Arabia and the UAE. They all love funding these Salafist groups, and they don't care who they kill.
All right, well, the agreement. Let's talk about the Adana Agreement, because this is what Erdogan says is the legal reason why it's cool for him to be in Syria. So the Adana Agreement was set up in October 1998, so a long fucking time ago, and it was set in the Turkish city of Adana. And the points for the agreement were as follows. So Syria would not permit any activity which it deemed jeopardizing the security and stability of Turkey, which in my opinion is super vague. It also would not allow any form of financial or material support for the group to be delivered via its territory. And of course here the group we're referring to is the PKK, the one that I went on a long spiel about. It says that Syria would not allow the PKK to establish new camps or take part in commercial activities within its borders. It says that Syria would not recognize the PKK as a terrorist organization. Excuse me, that Syria would recognize the PKK as a terrorist organization and prohibit all of its activities as well as the activities of any groups that are related to it on Syrian soil. It says that Syria would not allow PKK members to travel through Syria to some third country. It also says that Syria would not allow Abdullah Öcalan, the guy who started the PKK, to re-enter its borders. And the final point, and this is the most important in my opinion, should Syria fail to fulfill these demands, Turkey would have the right to chase PKK suspects 5 kilometers deep into Syria across the border of Syria and Turkey. So the main objective of this was to, kind of restore bilateral Syrian-Turkish relations. Bashar al-Assad actually said that he had to sign it under pressure, right? He said that, basically, he had to decide between being friends with Turkey or supporting Kurdish groups. And in that fight, he sided with Turkey. But it was a tough decision for him to make. Now, my conclusion on this Adana agreement is that the Adana agreement was prefaced on suppressing the growth of the PKK, which, of course, is a Kurdish political party. Idlib is nowhere near Kurdish-controlled north and northeast Syria. The Kurdish stronghold of Kamishli, which, by the way, in the next kind of buffer zones that we're going to talk about, is excluded. Kamishli is excluded. But the Kurdish stronghold of Kamishli is almost as far northeast as you can go, whereas Idlib is pretty much as far northwest as you can go. Right? They're on opposite sides of the country. Right? But even if you say, okay, forget it. Like, let's pretend that, all crazy militant groups are PKK or somehow loosely associated with them, and we're just going to bucket them into the same, group. Fine. Under the Adama agreement, the terms specify that if Syria fails to fulfill their part of the bargain, that Turkey would have the right to chase, specifically PKK, but we're broadening this out to any crazy militants, that they would have the right to chase them 5 kilometers deep into Syria across the Syria-Turkish border. Idlib, specifically, is more than 20 kilometers. So that's like 4 times as far into Syria from the border of Turkey. And Turkey's deepest observation post that they've set up in Syria is much farther than 20 kilometers into Syria from the Turkish border. So, in my opinion, the idea that Turkey's incursion into Syria per the Adana agreement is total bullshit. There's got to be something else going on there.
No, it's complete bullshit. It's complete horseshit. You said it. Idlib and the Kurdish-controlled zones in Syria were not even close to each other. They're not close. They're not close to each other at all.
So, what the fuck are they doing in Idlib?
Why are they in Idlib? Why? Why are they fighting with Al Qaeda? Why are they with Al Qaeda? HTS is Al Qaeda. Al Qaeda isn't all right. I want to just say. When I say Al Qaeda is not a centralized group with a hierarchy and a structure like a corporation. It's not like a top-down power structure. It's a decentralized group. So Al Qaeda has a bunch of groups that have who link with Al Qaeda, who kind of fly under the banner of an Al Qaeda type philosophy, which includes ISIS, which includes groups like Al Nusra, groups that you probably heard of. But they split. They're different with different leader structures, and they sometimes fight each other. So when I say Al Qaeda, I mean Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is an Al Qaeda linked group. Why are they with them? There was just a suicide bombing the other day. The two HTS guys they drove these I think they were Humvees. They're armored trucks into the Syrian lines. Just like these guys are nuts. Again, go to YouTube, type in OGN, Bilal Abdul Karim. There's Bilal Abdul Karim, and just look at them from their point of view. Look at what they want to come off as, and tell me that these guys are not fucking wackadoos. Like, these guys are insane. It's like, why are you with them?
Nevertheless, Turkey's protecting them, or at least tacitly protecting them.
It's these groups, and in Libya right now, Turkey is sending members of the Free Syrian Army to fight its wars in Libya right now. It's probably one of the reasons. I mean, it could be another reason. I could be wrong about this, but it's something that, comes to mind. Are they sending reinforcements into Idlib because they actually have people under the brand of the Free Syrian Army? That's what they're being called. That's going to Libya, but in actuality, that they're Al Qaeda types that are going over to. God damn. In reality, they're Al Qaeda groups that are going over to the fight for the government in Libya right now that's in a civil war. Even if so, I mean, the Free Syrian Army. Why is a free, even if there is a Free Syrian Army, why is the Free Syrian Army fighting in Libya, in the Libyan civil war? They're not even close to each other. Like, these two countries are not even
they're not even on the same continent.
They're not even on the same continent. Why are they sending? Since December, there have been Syrian rebels who have been filtered into Libya to fight on behalf of the propped up Muslim Brotherhood government in Libya, the UN government in Libya right now. And if you want to know something confusing right now, the civil war that's going on in Libya breaks all geopolitical conventions that we're used to. The GNA, the Government of National Accord, which is the Libyan government right now, their supporters are Qatar, Turkey, Italy, and Iran. Those are the supporters of it. Iran is a supporter. They covertly support the GNA, the government of Libya right now, with weapons. They do it covertly. And the sides that back General Haftar, the Libyan National Army, which this guy has failed, I think, 3 times now in the coup, who's actually one of the main stars in our Toyota War episode.
Yeah, he is.
He was a former, military commander in Gaddafi's army, and he got captured in the Toyota Wars, and he was dishonored. He started working with the CIA. The sides that prop up him are Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, Russia, France, and Jordan. And the U.S. has given him like lip service, like Trump has kind of said, yeah, like let the Saudis fund them. So you have a civil war, and not to go completely off tangent right now, but I figure this is a time to bring it up if we're going to bring this topic up at all. There's a civil war going on in Libya right now, and it's just completely filled with proxies on both sides. So on one side, you have proxies from Al Qaeda or from Syrian rebels, the Syrian rebel groups that are being filtered in there right now to fight for the Libyan government, the UN-backed government. And on the other side, on the Libyan National Army, the one that Saudi Arabia backs, you have Sudanese mercenaries on that side. So they're just two mercenary groups fighting each other. And it's all just for Libya, for things like oil interest and port access and like Mediterranean shipping rights and stuff like that.
It's like, you don't even go here, bro.
Yeah. It's all just like, it's not for any type of noble reason why they're fighting. It's all for just strategic, political interest between these countries. But it just breaks all the conventional barriers because, typically, you think of Saudi Arabia and Turkey being on the same side. Well, I guess not, because ever since Jamal Khashoggi has been murdered, they have not been on the same side in a lot of things. But it's just really funny. And then in reality, Turkey and Russia, even though that we're having these, like we said, like they're their economies are pretty dependent on each other with all the trade that they do, so they can't really go to war with each other. But like France and Italy, both countries that are in the EU, they're backing different sides. It's different Sunni countries are backing countries on each side. It's
super weird.
It's just super weird, and it just breaks the conventions. And I think it tells a lesson that, a lot of these wars, they're never for humanitarian reasons. The reasons are always more Machiavellian and have to do with geopolitical interest in those regions rather than alliances that are set in stone or by blood.
Well, let's kind of get back to Syria here. So to recap, we talked about the Adana Agreement. We talked about its focus on PKK, so a Kurdish majority political and militant group. And we talked about how, it's a 5 kilometer, a range that Turkey would have to act within Syria. And we proved that, all these other places are super far away from that. And then we talked about, in October 2018, the demilitarized zone that Syria and Turkey had set up, where all the tanks and stuff like that had to go out by October 2018, which Turkey didn't do. How the armed forces of Turkey and the military police of Russia had to carry out coordinated patrols, which they have refused to do them anymore. How allowing free movement of local residents and goods and economic ties and things like that had to be restored, which it hasn't. So they broke the Adana Agreement. They are breaking the October 2015 agreement. But there's 2 more kind of buffer zone agreements that happened since then that I want to talk about as well. And we can kind of pick these apart. So there's this first Northern Border Agreement. This came out in August 2019. And basically it set up this like specifics on a safe zone deal. And here are some specifics. So there would be a buffer zone created. It would be called the safe zone or the peace quarter. It just depends on who you ask. But it'd be established in the areas between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. But it specifically excludes the Manbij area in northern Syria, and it's about 115 kilometers of border between the two countries. The zone would have a 5 kilometer depth into most of these areas, with a few limited areas that would be expanded to about 9 to 14 kilometers. But the maximum here is about 14 kilometers. Again, Idlib is more than 20 away. The expanded part of that zone be located between I can't even fucking pronounce this name, Serikani in Turkey and Tel Abyad in Syria. And there's a 14 kilometer portion of the zone that can be extended by up to 4 more kilometers in the late stage of the deal. And it also says that YPG and YPJ, we didn't cover this in today's episode, but these are a specifically different Kurdish majority fighting force in Syria. It's not PKK, it's a different thing. But basically they would have to withdraw from that, let's call it 14 kilometer area of the buffer zone entirely. And this we talked about in October with the, pulling out of Syria episode. And it basically says that it would establish an autonomous administration of North and East Syria there. Now, it also says that Turkish reconnaissance aircraft would be allowed, but Turkish warplanes would not be allowed, and no airstrikes would take place. Again, Erdogan is saying that he did that, so if he's correct, which he definitely isn't, then he broke the terms of this agreement already. And then it also says that SDF would dismantle the Syrian Defense Forces, the Syrian army, would dismantle the border fortifications it constructed along the Syrian-Turkish borders. I don't actually know if that's happened or not. The U.S. and Turkey would conduct joint military patrols along the buffer zone. That never happened, especially because we pulled out. Separate Turkish patrols would not be permitted. So, like, its own patrols would not be permitted. Turkish patrols are happening nonetheless, so they broke it there. The U.S. joint The U.S. and Turkish Joint Operations Center would oversee implementation of the deal and coordinate. They actually did do this, but this deal fell apart anyway, so it doesn't matter. And some of the Syrian refugees currently housed in Turkey would start to be relocated in the areas of the zone, which I actually haven't read anything about this yet. This is the whole reason for the safe zone, is to safely move Syrian refugees. I actually haven't read anything about this, so who knows? Maybe it's happening, maybe it's not. Turkey would refrain from any incursions into northern Syria. Nope. And finally, Turkey would not establish any observation posts in northern Syria as it has done in Idlib. All observation posts would have to be built on the territory of the Republic of Turkey, which is clearly not happening, right? So they're clearly violating that last term. They are setting up plenty of observation posts way deep, way beyond that 14-kilometer zone in Syria. Just not. They're not doing that at all. Like, they're not doing that at all. So the first one totally broke down. That was in October, and as I pointed out, there were a number of places where they didn't do what they said they were supposed to do, including the observation posts not being built, including allegedly an airstrike that occurred in Syria, including joint patrols with both the U.S. and Russia, which they're not doing. So yeah, they totally. Yeah, that's bullshit. That agreement was totally violated. But then we got this other one. Then this one happened much more recently. And if I'm reading this correctly, actually the one that I just referred to was August 2019. This one is from October 2019. So it says this new one, which is also totally fucked, says that a new buffer zone would be established in northern Syria, and this zone would be 30 kilometers deep. Okay, cool. So now it actually does include parts of Idlib and parts of Aleppo. But it does exclude specific towns like Kamishli, that's the Kurds' de facto capital. And the buffer zone would be controlled by the Syrian army and Russian police. I guess that is the case, although, the fact that the Syrian army is trying to control the area and Turkey's not letting them, I guess, goes against that. And then we got the stuff about the YPG forces like withdrawing, which I haven't touched on recently, but I know that back in October they were withdrawing, so I don't know if there was been a full withdrawal there or not. And then after the YPG withdraws, it says that joint Russian-Turkish ground patrols will be held in the buffer zone, but only within the first 10 kilometers from the border and not including Kamishli. Again, the Turkish are not doing, they've refused to do these joint patrols, and they're going off and doing it themselves, or in certain cases, Russia's doing it by themselves. But it's definitely, any Turkish patrols that they're doing is definitely happening well beyond the 10-kilometer zone that they outlined in this agreement. So it says Turkey would retain sole control of the areas it had captured during the offensive between the towns of Tel Abyad and Ras Al Ain. That's important because they get to keep that, but I want to give you some geography again. Tel Abyad and Ras Al Ain is on the northeast side, so way, way, way far from Idlib. So this has nothing to do with Idlib. Syrian government would construct and man 15 border posts on the Turkish-Syrian border. I don't actually know if that's happened yet. The parties would launch a joint effort to resettle Syrian refugees. Again, I don't know if this has happened yet. Maybe, probably not, though. The parties would agree to preserve the political unity and territorial integrity of Syria, as well as protect the national security of Turkey. Okay, I'm just going to say that definitely didn't happen. And then the final point here says that the parties would agree to reaffirm the importance of the Adana Agreement, and Russia will facilitate the implementation of the Adana Agreement, which we've already discussed how that is totally broken. So, all right, that was a really long rant, dude. Sorry. But here's my point, and I'm gonna say it again. We've had several agreements about what the terms of a northern Syrian buffer zone is, and who controls what, and who does what, and what is allowed and what isn't. And in my opinion, after doing all this research on it, Of course, I came in with the bias of saying that I don't think that what Turkey is doing is correct, but I was able to confirm that belief with the evidence as presented in all three of these buffer zone agreements. There is no evidence, in my opinion, that gives Turkey legal recourse to be there. And if we want to talk, as you said, Henry, there's no moral reason for them to be there too, because they're just like propping up and protecting these fucking whack jobs, these HTS, these Al Qaeda members, basically. So, yeah, if I had to pick a side today, unfortunately, I think I'm going with Assad.
The beauty is you don't have to choose sides. Yeah. The beauty is that you don't have to choose sides between these governments. Mm-hmm. They're not your governments. You don't have to choose sides. Right. And there's no obligation for someone to choose between NATO and Syria. I guess technically there's a organization or club that we're in a club with Turkey. We're in a club. It's so funny that NATO accepted Turkey in a club just because that they could jack up and put nukes in them so they could bomb the Soviets. That's the only reason why they're in NATO. That was an interesting
choice.
It's like, all right, well, we're vulnerable, so we need to put nukes in this place where no other way that it would be accepted to this cool elite European club, just because we need to be in striking distance of Moscow.
Yeah. And to be clear, of the three parties that we've been talking about, so Syria and Turkey and Russia, my stance is I don't agree with any of their foreign policy at all, right? So I don't like any of them. And I think all of this is fucked. But to answer the question that I've just been just dying to know about the legality of this, I think, Turkey's definitely losing this case. They're losing. If this was put on trial, they're losing, in my opinion.
Yeah, they're losing, and they're also, I think, strategically, they're putting themselves in a pretty big hole. I don't think that I think they're going to have to pay for this. Especially these border disputes. Obviously, it's a lot easier to garner public support for your own public support. It's way easier to sell someone on a war that's on your border than sell a war that's in Libya right now, because now Turkey's getting involved in a war that's unpopular within Turkey.
Right.
I was looking at the approval ratings, and only 30% of the Turkish population approve of their escapades.
Don't tell Erdogan that. He thinks it's 130% approve.
I hate Erdogan so much. He's my least favorite ruler in the Middle East. I really dislike him. But that being said, there's a lot of rulers in the Middle East that are pretty bad.
Yeah.
You don't need to get some bandwagon attachment to different countries. I can't stand it when it's even it comes from people who are critical of U.S. foreign policy. They'll be like, oh, everything that the U.S. does is bad, therefore everything that Russia does is good. It's like, where do you get off on that? These are governments,
right?
They're all the bad guys. They're governments. They're not doing good. None of these foreign escapades are good. You should condemn all of them. But it's just I don't think it's going to be good for Erdogan in the long run. And honestly, we don't obviously. It certainly seems like, and it seemed like this for a really long time. So now we're sounding like I once said, and I was completely wrong about this, that the liberation in Idlib would take about 3 months. And I said that
and then Turkey.
No, I said that in probably October of 2018. And, obviously I wasn't right about that. It's been 2 years later.
It's nice of you to issue that correction.
Hey, man, I get a lot of things wrong. Yeah. When I get things wrong, though, I see it as a good thing, because then I grow from it. you have the opportunity to learn from things that you get wrong, and then you become smarter. So I feel like the more stuff I get wrong, the smarter I'll be in the future. That's like my mentality.
Yeah, as long as you learn.
At this rate, you're going to be super smart in this. At this rate, you'll be a fucking genius.
Super genius when you're 72 years old.
Yeah. You'll be Albert Einstein in 50 years. Too bad you'll be dead. But that's all I have to say about that.
Yeah.
That's all I got to say about that.
Cool, man. We'll keep watching this, and if anything, noteworthy comes out of it, or if we actually get some good ground sources to issue some corrections or just to add some additional context, we'll definitely follow up with this at some point. But I think this is most of what you need to know about what's going on in Turkey and Syria, and hopefully, you come out of this learning something.
Yeah, hopefully another siren is coming. All right, so we're only at an hour and 10 minutes, and usually we go for about an hour and a half. Is there any filler that you want to put in here?
No, but let's just ask everybody to continue to support us in the different ways that they can. So we've got a Patreon that we are adding some new content to. And if you want to support us financially, I think that's the greatest way to do so right now. And also just, if you like the show, and if you got to an hour and 10 minutes and you're like, hey, these guys have got a good thing going on here, like, tell your friends, let them know about us, and, hopefully get some downloads. And of course, the ever-present ask, please, if you're on Apple, rate and review us, go on that thing, leave us a nice comment, give us a 5-star review if you thought it was good. Give us a 3-star review if you thought it was, if we can do something better.
Don't give us a 3-star review. Just give us a 5-star review. Don't give them ideas.
But definitely leave us comments, because we read them, and we make adjustments based on them. And if you want to hear about something specific, if there's something that you'd like for us to talk about on the show, like, let us know. You can do that in the comments, in the ratings and the reviews, or you can email us at info@brohistory. It's a real email address that we really, really read, and we love responding to them. So let us know.
So, are you sure that you don't want to talk about Harry Potter and the cursed child for the next 20 minutes?
No,
or
I'm
should
good.
we spare the people listening?
I think we should.
You're going to get it either way, because I'm going to continue where I left off about Harry Potter and my critics' review of it. But maybe we'll save that for another day.
Patreon only exclusive. Actually, let's not, because that'll dissuade people from going on Patreon.
Okay, we're not going. We're all right. They'll be like, all right, I'll pass. just Harry Potter stuff. Thanks guys for listening. We'll be back on, I guess, Thursday of next week. We have a pretty good thing going here, and let us know what you guys. Let us know. Well, I guess you already covered that. All right, guys, I'm going to stop talking. I'm not making sense. Peace.
See ya.